Look at the geopolitical landscape today. Superpowers project military force globally, highly defined borders separate states, and international bodies aim to keep the peace. Go back 110 years and none of this existed. To understand the mechanics of the modern world, we first have to examine how the previous one was dismantled. Looking at this map of Europe in 1914, the power dynamic was drastically different. Global influence was heavily concentrated, held by sprawling entities like the British, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires. This massive consolidation of territory created a rigid, highly brittle international order. Enormous wealth and military capability were entirely directed by a small handful of royal families and imperial monarchs. The old world was flawed by militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. The greatest danger was the inescapable network of military alliances connecting capital cities. These interlocking treaties removed the option of isolated conflict, creating an automatic obligation to declare war. The system was put to the test in June of 1914, when a teenage militant shot and killed Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife during a parade in Sarajevo. That localized political murder in Sarajevo activated the alliance protocols. Within weeks, a cascade of declarations forced millions across the continent into immediate military mobilization. What could have been a contained political crisis acted as a hard system override, dragging millions of people into a total collapse of global diplomacy. This map shows Europe fractured into two distinct blocks: the Central Powers, anchored by Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Allied Powers, led by Britain, France, and Russia. Because these were immense empires, they pulled their overseas colonies into the fight, creating a worldwide operation. Diverse global populations were caught in the crossfire. Millions of colonial subjects were drafted into uniform to fight for monarchs thousands of miles away, like these troops recruited from Britain's territories in Africa. Governments instituted total war. The civilian economy was redirected entirely to the front lines, relying heavily on women to staff the factories and produce the staggering volume of artillery required to maintain the conflict. The vast resources of the earth, its factories, its minerals, and its people, were harnessed for a single, unified goal of exhausting the enemy. Military leaders approached this conflict expecting a traditional war of movement, ordering open infantry charges and cavalry advances, but they were riding directly into the jaws of modern, mechanized defense. The resulting stalemate forced millions of men to dig deep into the earth. The Western Front became a continuous, freezing labyrinth of trenches stretching for hundreds of miles. The constant, heavy pounding of mechanized artillery erased entire landscapes, reducing dense forests and farmland to lifeless craters of mud. To break the deadlock, engineers weaponized chemistry. Troops were issued crude protective masks to survive the release of chlorine and mustard gas, introducing a deeply psychological terror to the trenches. Massive armored machines were also designed to cross the deadly expanse of no man's land, absorbing gunfire that would have shredded infantry units. Combat was reduced to a brutal mathematical equation. The generals were feeding raw human bodies into an industrial machine designed purely for attrition. Engagements like the Battle of the Somme and Verdun lasted for months. Millions of lives were traded for territorial gains measured in yards, leaving regional towns entirely leveled. By 1917, the combatants were bleeding out. National treasuries were drained, economies were rationing basic food supplies, and frontline units were beginning to mutiny against their commanders. In April of that year, the United States abandoned its policy of isolationism and committed active combat troops to the Allied effort. The arrival of the Americans injected fresh, untouched industrial capacity into a theater of war where the original players were physically and financially exhausted. The sheer volume of new materials and personnel proved too heavy a burden for the Central Powers, breaking their defensive lines and forcing an armistice in November 1918. When the guns finally stopped, the four ancient empires that had engineered the conflict, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans, had entirely collapsed. The victors gathered at a palace outside Paris to formalize the terms of surrender through the Treaty of Versailles. As this map illustrates, the resulting treaty heavily penalized Germany, seizing its territory, strictly limiting its military, and imposing severe financial debts as punishment. Instead of establishing a framework for lasting stability, the treaty prioritized retribution. It functioned as a deeply flawed 20-year ceasefire, generating the economic desperation that would directly feed a second global conflict. One major diplomatic experiment did emerge from the wreckage: the League of Nations. It was the first instance of global governments attempting a formal, permanent coalition to resolve disputes and prevent future global conflict. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was a primary architect of this new international order, though he failed to convince his own country to join the organization. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire allowed the victors to partition its vast territories into the specific mandates and borders that define the modern Middle East. This conflict also shifted the center of global influence toward the United States and provided the structural foundations for the eventual creation of the United Nations. It was a tragedy of immense scale. The First World War acted as a harsh, unyielding fire, burning away centuries of imperial tradition to forge the fragile mechanics of the reality we live in today.